In the 3rd century before the Common Era, the Mediterranean world existed under the dominance of expanding powers whose territorial ambitions shaped the lives of every city and kingdom along its shores. Syracuse, positioned on the eastern coast of Sicily, functioned as one of several significant Greek colonies that had established themselves across the island centuries earlier. The city maintained its independence through a combination of military strength, strategic alliances, and the wealth generated by its agricultural hinterland and maritime trade routes. Syracuse was governed by tyrants, a Greek term denoting rulers who had seized power outside traditional constitutional frameworks, though the nature of their rule varied considerably depending on the individual and the circumstances of their reign. The Mediterranean of this period was characterized by a complex network of trade relationships, military alliances, and cultural exchanges that connected distant regions into a system of mutual dependencies and conflicts. Ships carried grain from Sicily and Egypt to feed populations in Greece and Italy, while luxury goods traveled from the eastern Mediterranean westward to markets in newer settlements. The movement of people accompanied these flows of goods with merchants, craftsmen, soldiers, and slaves, creating cosmopolitan populations in major port cities. Ideas and cultural practices moved along these same routes, spreading religious cults, philosophical doctrines, artistic styles, and technical knowledge across linguistic and political boundaries. Sicily occupied a strategic position in this system, situated at the intersection of eastern and western Mediterranean spheres of influence. The island's fertile soil produced abundant grain harvests that made it economically valuable to whatever power could control its agricultural output. Its position between Italy and Africa gave it military significance as a base for naval operations and as a stepping stone for armies moving between continents. The island's cultural character reflected its position, with Greek cities along the eastern and southern coasts, Carthaginian settlements in the west, and native Sicel and Sicanian populations in the interior maintaining their own traditions while gradually adopting elements of Greek and Carthaginian culture. Syracuse had been founded in the 8th century, before the Common Era, by colonists from Corinth, establishing itself on a peninsula that offered natural harbor facilities and defensive advantages. The original settlement had expanded over the centuries to include multiple districts, both on the peninsula itself and on adjacent mainland territory. The city's population had grown through natural increase and through the absorption of surrounding populations, reaching a size that made it one of the larger urban centers in the Greek world. Its physical infrastructure reflected this growth, with successive building programs adding temples, fortifications, public buildings, and water management systems that served both practical needs and symbolic purposes of displaying civic wealth and power. Greek civilization in this period had already produced several centuries of philosophical inquiry, mathematical investigation, and engineering achievement. The works of earlier thinkers had been preserved in written form and circulated among educated communities throughout the Greek-speaking world. Schools of philosophy operated in Athens and other major cities, while centers of learning had begun to emerge in newer foundations, such as Alexandria in Egypt, where the Ptolemaic dynasty had established an institution dedicated to the collection and study of written knowledge. Mathematical understanding had progressed from basic arithmetic and geometry to more sophisticated investigations of proportion, number theory, and the properties of geometric figures. The methods used in these investigations relied on logical deduction from accepted principles, with demonstrations constructed through careful reasoning rather than empirical observation alone. The philosophical schools that had emerged in Athens and other cities maintained distinct doctrines and methods while engaging in ongoing debates about fundamental questions concerning the nature of reality, the basis of knowledge, and the proper conduct of human life. The Academy, founded by Plato, emphasized the study of abstract forms and mathematical relationships as paths to understanding eternal truths that transcended the changing material world. The Lyceum, established by Aristotle, pursued systematic investigation of natural phenomena through observation and logical analysis, developing classifications of living things, theories of motion and change, and frameworks for understanding ethical and political questions. The Stoa and the Garden offered competing visions of how philosophy should guide individual behavior and attitudes toward fortune and misfortune. These schools operated through a combination of formal instruction and informal discussion, with established teachers presenting doctrines to students who paid fees or received support from wealthy patrons. The instruction often centered on close reading and interpretation of texts written by the school's founder or other authoritative figures, though original investigation and development of new arguments remained possible for advanced students and teachers. The social organization of these schools created communities of scholars bound together by shared intellectual commitments and personal relationships, with networks extending across cities through correspondence and occasional travel. Mathematical knowledge occupied a distinctive position within this intellectual landscape, valued both for its practical utility and for its capacity to demonstrate certain truths through pure reason. The geometric method developed by Euclid and his predecessors provided a model of how knowledge could be systematically organized, beginning from definitions and axioms, and proceeding through logical demonstration to establish a body of proven propositions. This approach had been applied to plane geometry, solid geometry, number theory, and certain aspects of astronomy, creating a substantial corpus of mathematical knowledge that could be taught and studied. The certainty achieved through mathematical proof contrasted with the more tentative and disputed conclusions reached in other domains of inquiry where empirical evidence and logical argument might point in different directions or fail to resolve questions definitively. The social structure of Greek cities placed educated free men at the top of a hierarchy that included various categories of free workers, slaves, and resident foreigners who lacked full political rights. Wealth derived primarily from land ownership, though commerce and certain crafts could also generate significant income. Education remained the privilege of those families with sufficient resources to support extended periods of study for their sons, and literacy itself was far from universal even among free citizens. The educated class engaged with intellectual pursuits as a marker of status and as a proper use of leisure time, with practical applications often regarded as secondary to the intrinsic value of knowledge and understanding. Religious observance permeated daily life, with festivals, sacrifices, and other ritual activities following calendars that varied from city to city. The gods were understood to take an active interest in human affairs, and proper reverence toward them was considered essential for both personal welfare and civic prosperity. Natural phenomena were interpreted through this religious framework, though some thinkers had begun to propose explanations based on observation and reasoning about material causes rather than divine intervention. These naturalistic explanations coexisted alongside traditional religious beliefs without necessarily displacing them. Into this world, around the year 287 before the Common Era, Archimedes was born in Syracuse. His father, Phidias, worked as an astronomer, a profession that combined observation of celestial phenomena with mathematical calculation to predict the positions and movements of heavenly bodies. The family appears to have belonged to the class of citizens with sufficient education and resources to engage in intellectual work rather than manual labor or commerce. Syracuse at this time enjoyed relative prosperity and maintained its position as one of the most powerful cities in the Greek world, though it existed in the shadow of expanding Roman power to the north and Carthaginian interests to the west and south. The city itself featured harbors both large and small, fortifications that had been expanded and improved over generations, public buildings including temples and administrative structures, and residential districts that varied considerably in character depending on the wealth of their inhabitants. The wider territory controlled by Syracuse included agricultural land worked by slaves and free farmers, smaller towns that acknowledged Syracusan authority, and coastal areas used for fishing and maritime activities. The population was mixed, including descendants of the original Greek colonists, native Sicilians who had been absorbed into the city's structures, and various groups of traders and workers who had come from elsewhere in the Mediterranean world. Archimedes received an education appropriate to his family's status, beginning with basic literacy in Greek and advancing to the study of poetry, music, and the works of earlier thinkers. Mathematics formed part of this education, initially encountered through the study of geometry as presented in systematic form by earlier teachers. The geometric method involved beginning with definitions and fundamental assumptions, then deriving further propositions through logical demonstration. Students learned to construct proofs, to recognize valid and invalid arguments, and to apply geometric principles to practical problems involving measurement and calculation. The process of learning geometry in this period required mastering both the logical structure of demonstrations and the practical skills of construction using compass and straight edge. Students practiced drawing accurate figures, working through the steps of proofs until the logical connections became clear, and solving problems that required applying known propositions to new situations. The training developed both technical facility with geometric reasoning and broader habits of thought, emphasizing precision, logical necessity, and the distinction between what could be proven and what remained merely plausible or probable. This mathematical education formed part of a larger curriculum that included physical training, music, poetry, rhetoric, and other subjects, considered essential for an educated Greek citizen. The teaching methods employed in this education relied heavily on direct interaction between teacher and student, with written texts serving as aids to memory and reference rather than as primary sources of instruction. A student would watch a teacher construct a proof, follow the logical steps, ask questions about difficult passages, and then practice reconstructing the demonstration independently. This process of guided practice under expert supervision allowed students to develop understanding through active engagement rather than passive reception of information. The relationship between teacher and student often extended beyond formal instruction to include broader mentorship and the transmission of values and attitudes toward knowledge and inquiry. Whether Archimedes traveled to Alexandria to continue his studies remains uncertain, though later accounts suggest contact with the scholarly community that had formed around the library and museum established by the Ptolemaic rulers. Alexandria had become a center for mathematical and astronomical work, attracting scholars from across the Greek world with the promise of access to collected texts, support from royal patronage, and the opportunity to exchange ideas with other learned men. The institution maintained a collection of written works that far exceeded anything available elsewhere, employed scholars to edit and comment on these texts, and provided resources for sustained intellectual inquiry, freed from the necessity of earning a living through other means. The library at Alexandria represented an unprecedented attempt to gather comprehensive knowledge in written form with agents sent throughout the Mediterranean world to acquire copies of books on every subject. The collection included works of literature, philosophy, history, medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and practical arts, organized and catalogued to facilitate access by scholars. The museum provided physical space for study and discussion, along with support for scholars who worked on editing texts, writing commentaries, and conducting original research. This institutional framework created conditions favorable for intellectual work, though it also introduced new social dynamics, as scholars competed for positions and patronage within a hierarchical system ultimately dependent on royal favor. The mathematical community that formed in Alexandria included scholars working on a range of problems and approaches, from purely theoretical investigations of geometric properties to practical applications in astronomy, surveying, and mechanics. They built upon the foundations laid by Euclid, whose systematic treatment of geometry had been produced in Alexandria a generation or two earlier, and they extended mathematical inquiry into new domains. The exchange of ideas through both personal conversation and written correspondence allowed individual scholars to learn from one another's work, to identify gaps or errors in proposed demonstrations, and to develop collective understanding that advanced beyond what any single individual could achieve in isolation. The mathematical community in Alexandria during this period included several figures whose work would be preserved and studied for centuries afterward. They corresponded with one another, posed problems for investigation, and built upon the foundations laid by earlier geometers. Their methods emphasized rigorous demonstration and logical necessity rather than approximate or empirical approaches. A proof was considered valid only if it proceeded necessarily from accepted first principles through steps that could not be denied without contradiction. This standard of certainty distinguished mathematical knowledge from other forms of understanding that relied on experience, testimony, or probable reasoning. Archimedes appears to have formed connections with several members of this community, maintaining correspondence with them after any direct contact had ended. These letters served not only to communicate results, but also to pose challenges, request verification of claimed discoveries, and maintain relationships across geographical distance. The practice of challenging other mathematicians to solve problems functioned as a form of intellectual competition, though one governed by shared standards of rigor and proof. Solutions had to be demonstrated through valid geometric reasoning, not merely asserted or supported by numerical examples. Returning to Syracuse, Archimedes settled into a pattern of life that combined private study with occasional consultation on practical matters related to the city's affairs. He did not hold a formal teaching position or operate a school in the manner of some philosophers, nor did he receive a regular salary from any institution. Instead, he appears to have devoted himself to mathematical investigation while maintaining relationships with the ruling family of Syracuse and with other scholars elsewhere in the Mediterranean world. His social position allowed him the leisure necessary for sustained intellectual work, a privilege unavailable to the vast majority of the population who had to work for their subsistence. The economic basis for this leisured existence rested on property ownership and family wealth accumulated over generations. Land produced rent from tenants who farmed it. Urban properties generated income from shops and workshops operated by others, and investments in trading ventures or loans could yield returns without requiring direct involvement in commerce. This system of wealth, derived from ownership rather than labor, created a class of citizens who could devote their time to political participation, military service, religious activities, intellectual pursuits, or other endeavors considered appropriate for free men of status. The actual management of properties and collection of rents often fell to slaves or hired agents, further insulating wealthy citizens from direct engagement with economic production. Within this framework, Archimedes could structure his days according to the demands of mathematical investigation rather than external schedules imposed by employment or business obligations. The rhythm of work followed the natural cycle of daylight, with the hours after dawn often devoted to fresh problems when mental energy was highest. The middle of the day, particularly in summer, when heat made concentrated thinking difficult, might be given over to rest, exercise, or social activities. Late afternoon and evening offered additional time for study before the limitations of lamplight made detailed work impractical. This pattern varied with the seasons, with longer summer days providing extended working time and shorter winter days constraining the hours available for reading and calculation. The daily routine of such a life followed patterns dictated by the rhythms of the city and the seasons. Daylight hours provided the light necessary for reading and writing, with artificial illumination limited to oil lamps that gave insufficient light for detailed work. The heat of summer afternoons might drive indoor activities to a halt, while winter days offered fewer working hours. Social obligations, including religious festivals, civic assemblies, and private hospitality, required time and attention. The work of thinking and calculating proceeded within these constraints, advancing through periods of concentrated effort, interrupted by other demands. The physical environment for intellectual work in this period consisted of relatively simple furnishings and equipment adapted to local climate conditions. A room might contain a table or desk for writing, chairs or benches for sitting, storage chests for papyrus rolls and other materials, and perhaps a stand for holding a scroll at reading height. In warmer months, work might be conducted in open courtyards or covered porticos that provided shade while allowing air circulation. In cooler weather, braziers could provide heat, though the smoke and fumes from burning charcoal made prolonged exposure unpleasant and potentially dangerous in enclosed spaces. The modest material requirements for mathematical work meant that a scholar needed primarily time, mental capacity, and writing materials rather than elaborate equipment or facilities. Mathematical investigation in this period required limited physical resources but considerable mental discipline. Writing materials consisted of papyrus sheets or rolls, which were expensive enough to be used carefully, and wax-covered wooden tablets that could be smoothed and reused for calculations and rough work. Geometric diagrams were drawn in sand or dust, scratched on tablets or carefully rendered on papyrus when a permanent record was desired. The absence of algebraic notation meant that all reasoning had to be expressed in geometric terms or in natural language, making certain types of manipulations more cumbersome than they would later become. Archimedes worked on problems involving the measurement of curved figures and solid bodies, developing methods to determine their areas and volumes. Earlier geometers had established formulas for simple figures such as triangles, rectangles, and circles, and had demonstrated properties of basic solids including cubes, cylinders, and spheres. More complex shapes posed greater difficulties, particularly those involving curved surfaces or irregular forms. The challenge lay in finding rigorous proofs rather than approximate measurements, ensuring that the relationships claimed were necessary consequences of geometric principles rather than contingent results that happened to hold in particular cases. The method Archimedes developed for approaching these problems involved comparing the unknown area or volume to known quantities through a process of exhaustion. By inscribing polygons within a curved figure and circumscribing polygons around it, he could establish bounds on the unknown quantity. As the number of sides in the polygons increased, these bounds converged, allowing him to demonstrate that the true value must lie between limits that could be made arbitrarily close to one another. This approach required careful management of proportions and inequalities, ensuring that each step followed necessarily from the previous one. The logical structure of this method depended on establishing that the difference between the polygons and the curved figure could be made smaller than any predetermined amount by increasing the number of sides sufficiently. This did not require actually carrying out the construction with infinitely many sides, which would have been meaningless, but rather demonstrating that for any proposed value different from the claimed result, contradictions would arise from the properties of the inscribed and circumscribed figures. The reasoning employed a form of reductio ad absurdum, showing that assuming the area or volume differed from the claimed value led to conclusions that contradicted established geometric truths. Implementing this method required substantial technical facility with geometric reasoning about similar figures, proportions, and the behavior of sequences of increasing polygons. Archimedes had to show that each successive polygon approached the curved boundary more closely, that the areas or volumes of these polygons could be calculated using known formulas, and that the ratios between successive polygons followed patterns that could be summed or otherwise manipulated to yield the final result. The details varied depending on the specific figure under investigation, but the underlying logic remained consistent across applications. The investigation of the parabola, a curve generated by the intersection of a cone with a plane parallel to one of its sides, demonstrated the power of this approach. The parabola had been studied by earlier geometers who had established its basic properties, but Archimedes determined the area enclosed by a parabolic segment, the region between the parabola and a straight line cutting across it. He showed that this area equaled exactly 4/3 the area of a triangle, having the same base and height as the segment. The proof proceeded by inscribing triangles within the parabolic segment in a systematic way, showing that the sum of all these triangular areas approached the 4/3 ratio as more triangles were added. This result possessed both theoretical interest and potential practical application as parabolic shapes appeared in various contexts, including the paths of projectiles and the forms of certain architectural elements. The precision of the ratio, exactly 4/3 rather than some more complicated relationship, reflected underlying geometric regularities that connected the parabola to simpler figures whose properties were already well understood. The demonstration that such a precise relationship existed and could be proven rigorously exemplified the kind of knowledge that mathematical investigation could produce. He investigated the properties of spirals, curves that wind outward from a central point at a constant rate. The spiral had been studied before, but Archimedes developed a systematic treatment that established its fundamental properties and relationships. He determined the area enclosed by one turn of the spiral and demonstrated how this area related to the circle of corresponding radius. The work required developing new techniques for dealing with a curve that could not be generated through the simple compass and straight-edge constructions that dominated classical geometry. The study of solid bodies led Archimedes to investigate the sphere and the cylinder, two forms that appeared frequently in both theoretical mathematics and practical applications. He demonstrated that a sphere occupies exactly 2/3 the volume of the smallest cylinder that can contain it, and that the surface area of the sphere bears the same relationship to the total surface area of the cylinder, including its bases. This result possessed an elegance and simplicity that Archimedes himself valued highly, considering it among his most significant achievements. The proof required careful geometric reasoning about the properties of these three-dimensional forms and the relationships between their measurements. Problems of equilibrium and balance also occupied his attention. Physical objects were observed to balance at certain points and to tip over when supported elsewhere. Levers could multiply force, allowing small weights to lift larger ones when positioned at appropriate distances from the fulcrum. These phenomena had been noticed and used for practical purposes long before any systematic investigation of their principles, but Archimedes approached them through mathematical reasoning rather than empirical trial alone. He sought to establish why these effects occurred, deriving the law of the lever from considerations of symmetry and geometric proportion rather than from accumulated observations. The principle he established stated that two weights balance when their distances from the fulcrum stand in inverse proportion to the weights themselves. A weight twice as heavy as another would balance it when placed half as far from the pivot point. This relationship could be demonstrated by considering the system as composed of smaller equal weights distributed along the lever, with the balance point determined by where these weights would maintain equilibrium. The argument proceeded through geometric reasoning about centers of gravity and symmetric distributions, establishing a necessary connection between the observed behavior and underlying mathematical relationships. Extended application of these principles led to investigations of centers of gravity for various geometric figures. A flat shape could be thought of as possessing a point at which it would balance perfectly if suspended, with the weight distributed symmetrically around this center. For simple symmetric figures, such as circles or squares, the center of gravity coincided with the geometric center. For more complex or irregular shapes, determining this point required more sophisticated analysis. Archimedes developed methods for finding centers of gravity through geometric demonstration, treating the problem as fundamentally mathematical rather than merely practical. The study of floating bodies brought together geometric reasoning with physical observation. Objects placed in water either sank or floated, depending on their relationship to the water they displaced. Archimedes investigated the conditions under which bodies would float and the positions they would assume when partially submerged. He established that a floating body displaces a volume of water whose weight equals the weight of the body itself, a principle that explained both the floating of light materials and the sinking of heavy ones. The analysis extended to objects of irregular shape and to questions of stability, determining whether a floating body would remain upright or tip over into a different position. These investigations were formulated as mathematical propositions demonstrated through geometric argument rather than as empirical generalizations based on observation alone. The validity of the conclusions depended on their logical derivation from accepted principles about weight, volume, and equilibrium rather than on their confirmation through experiment. Physical observations might suggest relationships to investigate, but the certainty of mathematical knowledge came from proof rather than from accumulated evidence. Letters to other mathematicians presented results in the form of statements followed by demonstrations, sometimes accompanied by challenges to find proofs independently before the solution was revealed. This practice served both to communicate discoveries and to establish precedents for particular results. A mathematician who could demonstrate a claimed relationship possessed knowledge that could be verified by others working through the same logical steps. The sharing of such knowledge reinforced the community of scholars even across distances that prevented regular face-to-face contact. Archimedes also engaged with practical problems presented by the needs of the city and its rulers. Syracuse maintained a fleet of ships for trade and warfare, and improvements in ship design or construction could provide advantages over competitors and enemies. The loading and unloading of cargo, the calculation of capacities, and the stability of vessels all involved questions that could be addressed through mathematical understanding combined with practical knowledge of shipbuilding. Whether Archimedes contributed directly to specific vessel designs remains uncertain, though later accounts attribute to him various mechanical inventions and improvements. The use of compound pulleys to move heavy objects appears among the devices associated with his name. A system of multiple pulleys arranged appropriately could allow a single person to lift weights far exceeding what direct effort could accomplish. The mechanical advantage gained through such arrangements followed from the same principles that governed levers, with the force distributed across multiple ropes that each bore a portion of the total weight. The actual construction of such systems required practical knowledge of materials, rope strength, and mechanical components, but the underlying principles could be understood through mathematical analysis of forces and distances. Water-lifting devices of various kinds existed throughout the ancient world, used to irrigate fields, drain mines, and supply water to elevated locations. One such device, later associated with Archimedes, employed a helical screw enclosed in a cylinder that could lift water when rotated. Whether Archimedes invented this device, encountered it during travels to Egypt, where similar mechanisms were used, or merely described its principles, remains unclear from the surviving evidence. The device functioned through the continuous upward spiral that water followed as the screw rotated, with each rotation lifting the water higher until it emerged from the upper end. The relationship between the ruler of Syracuse and Archimedes appears to have been one of mutual respect without formal obligation. The tyrant Hiero II, who governed Syracuse during much of Archimedes' adult life, commissioned works from him and consulted him on matters where mathematical or mechanical knowledge might prove useful. This relationship provided Archimedes with both resources and occasional direction for his investigations, while allowing him to pursue his own interests when not called upon for specific tasks. The arrangement benefited both parties, giving Hiero access to exceptional expertise while providing Archimedes with the security and support necessary for sustained intellectual work. A problem involving a crown made of gold illustrates the intersection of practical concerns and mathematical principles. Hiero had commissioned a votive crown to be made from a specific weight of gold, but suspected that the craftsman had substituted silver for some of the gold while keeping the total weight correct. Determining the composition without damaging the crown posed a challenge, as weighing alone could not reveal whether the material was pure gold or a mixture of gold and lighter silver. Archimedes recognized that the problem could be solved by determining the crown's volume and comparing it to the volume that the same weight of pure gold would occupy. The difficulty lay in measuring the volume of an irregularly shaped object with sufficient accuracy. Archimedes realized that immersing the crown in water and measuring the volume of water displaced would give the crown's volume exactly. Comparing this to the volume displaced by an equal weight of pure gold would reveal whether the crown occupied more space than it should, indicating the presence of lighter silver. The principle depended on the fact that different materials occupy different volumes for the same weight, a relationship that could be investigated through the displacement of water. Whether this particular incident occurred as described or represents a later elaboration cannot be determined with certainty, but the principle involved was genuine and applicable to such problems. The passing years saw Archimedes continue his mathematical work while Syracuse navigated the increasingly complex political situation in the Mediterranean. Rome had expanded its power southward through the Italian peninsula and had begun to contest control of Sicily with Carthage. The First Punic War had ended with Roman victory and the acquisition of most of Sicily, though Syracuse had managed to preserve its independence through alliance with Rome. This arrangement held as long as mutual interests aligned, but the potential for conflict remained whenever circumstances shifted. Hiero II maintained Syracuse's independence through careful diplomacy and the strength of the city's fortifications and fleet. His long reign provided stability and allowed the city to prosper through trade and agriculture. Archimedes continued to work during this period, producing treatises on mathematical subjects and maintaining correspondence with scholars elsewhere. The relative peace of these decades permitted sustained intellectual effort without the disruptions that war and political upheaval would bring. The methods Archimedes developed for determining areas and volumes extended to increasingly complex figures. He investigated sections of solids formed by cutting spheres and other bodies with planes at various angles. The resulting shapes, which included segments of spheres and parabolic solids, required new approaches for determining their volumes. He established relationships between these volumes and those of simpler figures, such as cylinders and cones, providing formulas that expressed the unknown quantities in terms of known dimensions. The mathematical technique of balancing played a role in these investigations, with geometric figures imagined as physical objects whose weights concentrated at their centers of gravity. By balancing complex shapes against known forms whose volumes were established, Archimedes could determine the ratios between them. This mechanical approach to geometric problems blended physical intuition with mathematical reasoning, though the final proofs proceeded through purely geometric demonstration independent of any physical interpretation. Approximations of the value relating the circumference of a circle to its diameter occupied another line of investigation. Earlier mathematicians had recognized that this ratio remained constant for all circles, but determining its precise value posed difficulties. Archimedes approached the problem by calculating the perimeters of polygons inscribed within and circumscribed around a circle. By using polygons with increasing numbers of sides, he could establish upper and lower bounds on the true value of the ratio, beginning with hexagons and doubling the number of sides repeatedly. He eventually worked with polygons of 96 sides, achieving bounds that located the ratio between 3 1/7 and 3 10/71. The calculation required manipulating square roots and fractions to determine the side lengths of successive polygons. Each doubling of sides followed from geometric relationships that expressed the new side length in terms of the previous one and the radius of the circle. The arithmetic became increasingly complex as the number of sides grew, but Archimedes worked through the calculations methodically, establishing at each stage that the bounds he claimed were valid consequences of the geometric constructions and the properties of the polygons involved. As Archimedes advanced in age, the political situation in the Mediterranean deteriorated from Syracuse's perspective. Hiero II died in 216 before the Common Era, having ruled for more than 50 years. His successor, his grandson Hieronymus, reversed the policy of alliance with Rome and instead aligned Syracuse with Carthage, which was at that time engaged in the Second Punic War under the leadership of Hannibal. This decision placed Syracuse in direct opposition to Rome, ending decades of peaceful coexistence and exposing the city to Roman military action. The Second Punic War had begun several years earlier when Hannibal, son of the Carthaginian general Hamilcar Barca, who had fought in the First Punic War, embarked on a campaign that took his army from Spain through southern Gaul and across the Alps into Italy. The audacity of this march and the string of victories Hannibal achieved against Roman armies in the opening years of the war had shaken Roman confidence and altered the strategic situation throughout the Mediterranean. After devastating defeats at the Trebia River, Lake Trasimene, and most catastrophically at Cannae, Rome faced the prospect of losing control over its Italian allies and potentially facing defeat at the hands of Carthage. In this context, Syracuse's defection from its Roman alliance represented both a strategic threat and an opportunity for Carthage to establish a secure base in Sicily from which to support Hannibal's campaign in Italy. Control of Sicilian ports would facilitate the movement of supplies and reinforcements from North Africa to Carthaginian forces operating in the Italian peninsula. The grain production of Sicily could feed Carthaginian armies and relieve pressure on supply lines extending from distant territories. For Rome, preventing this outcome required reasserting control over Syracuse despite the military demands of fighting Hannibal elsewhere. Hieronymus ruled for only a brief period before being assassinated, throwing Syracuse into political turmoil. Various factions competed for control while the city attempted to navigate its relationships with both Rome and Carthage. The internal politics of Syracuse during this period involved complex struggles between pro-Roman and pro-Carthaginian groups, between those favoring oligarchic and more democratic constitutional arrangements, and between different families and individuals seeking power. The instability created by these conflicts weakened the city's ability to respond coherently to external threats while making it difficult for any faction to establish unchallenged authority. The Romans, already engaged in a difficult war with Hannibal in Italy, viewed Syracuse's defection as both a threat and an opportunity. A Syracusan alliance with Carthage could provide the Carthaginians with a base in Sicily and resources to support their war effort, while the conquest of Syracuse would eliminate this possibility and assert Roman dominance over the entire island. The strategic calculus favored committing forces to Sicily despite the demands of the Italian campaign, as success would remove a potential source of support for Hannibal and demonstrate Roman capability to conduct military operations on multiple fronts simultaneously. In 214 before the Common Era, Roman forces under the command of the consul Marcus Claudius Marcellus began operations against Syracuse. The city's fortifications, strengthened over centuries and benefiting from its position between harbors and elevated ground, presented formidable obstacles to a direct assault. The Romans attempted to attack both by land and by sea, bringing siege engines and ships equipped to approach and scale the city's walls. Syracuse's defenders, under the direction of civic and military leaders who had emerged after Hieronymus's death, prepared to resist the siege using all available resources. Roman siege warfare in this period had developed into a systematic practice combining engineering works with military force to overcome defended positions. Standard approaches included surrounding the target with fortified camps to prevent relief or escape, constructing ramps and towers to bring attackers up to the level of defensive walls, employing battering rams to breach gates or walls, and using artillery to suppress defenders while assault forces approached. The Romans had refined these techniques through extensive experience in their conquest of Italy and their conflicts with Carthage, developing both the technical knowledge and the organizational capacity to conduct prolonged sieges against well-defended cities. Syracuse's defensive position enjoyed several natural advantages that complicated Roman efforts. The city occupied a peninsula jutting into the sea, with water protecting approaches from multiple directions. The landward side featured walls built at various periods, with some sections incorporating earlier Greek fortifications and others representing more recent construction. These walls varied in height and thickness, with towers positioned at intervals to provide flanking fire against attackers. Behind the outer walls, the terrain rose in places, creating multiple defensive lines that attackers would have to overcome even if they breached the first barrier. The harbors allowed ships to enter and potentially bring supplies, though Roman naval forces could attempt to blockade these entrances. Archimedes participated in these defensive preparations, applying his mechanical knowledge to the design and construction of engines for defending the walls. Catapults of various sizes could hurl stones and projectiles at attacking forces, with the range and power of these devices depending on their design and the materials used in their construction. The principles governing their operation involved stored energy released through the sudden unwinding of twisted rope or sinew, with the trajectory and distance of the projectile determined by the angle of release and the amount of energy imparted. Archimedes' understanding of levers and mechanical advantage informed the construction of these devices, allowing for engines of exceptional power and accuracy. The engineering of these defensive engines required understanding the relationship between the dimensions of the machine, the materials used in its construction, and the performance that could be achieved. Larger machines could store more energy and throw heavier projectiles longer distances, but they also became more difficult to construct, required more robust foundations to withstand the forces generated, and took longer to operate and reload. The twisted rope or sinew bundles that stored energy had to be carefully prepared and maintained, as their performance degraded with use and exposure to weather. The frames and arms of the machines had to be strong enough to withstand the stresses generated during operation, without being so heavy that they became immobile or difficult to position. The placement of these engines along the defensive walls involved tactical calculations about fields of fire, the ability to concentrate multiple weapons on likely attack points, and the need to protect the engines themselves from enemy artillery. Some positions offered better views of approaching forces but exposed the defenders to counter-battery fire. Others provided protection but limited the angles at which the weapons could be employed effectively. The defenders had to balance these considerations while working within the constraints imposed by existing wall structures and the physical layout of the city's fortifications. Cranes positioned on the walls could reach out over attacking ships, dropping heavy weights onto their decks or grasping them with iron hooks to lift and overturn them. These devices operated through combinations of levers, pulleys, and counterweights, applying the same principles that allowed small forces to move large weights through mechanical advantage. The unexpected appearance of these defensive engines and their effectiveness against the Roman naval assault created confusion and fear among the attackers, who found their ships vulnerable to weapons deployed from positions they had thought safely out of reach. The operation of these cranes required careful coordination between multiple operators working together to position the device, lower the grasping mechanism, secure it to the target ship, and then lift or pull the vessel. The timing had to account for wave action that caused both the wall and the ship to move relative to each other, making the task more complex than simply operating the crane in still conditions. The structural requirements for supporting these heavy machines on top of existing walls necessitated reinforcement of the wall sections where they were installed, adding to the engineering challenges involved in their deployment. The psychological impact of these defensive innovations on the Roman forces may have equaled their material effectiveness. Soldiers approaching walls, defended by weapons of unexpected design and capability, would have experienced heightened anxiety about what other surprises might await them. The disruption of standard siege tactics that had worked in previous campaigns forced Roman commanders to reconsider their approach and develop new methods for dealing with defenses they had not previously encountered. This delay and uncertainty worked to Syracuse's advantage, buying time for the defenders while forcing the Romans to commit additional resources to the siege. The transition from active warfare to prolonged siege altered the nature of the conflict and the experiences of those involved. The initial phase of dramatic assaults and fierce defensive actions gave way to a war of attrition in which both sides sought to exhaust the other's will and resources. For the Roman forces, this meant maintaining their encircling positions through changing seasons, managing their own supply lines extending back to Roman-controlled territory, and dealing with disease and desertion that afflicted armies remaining in one place for extended periods. For Syracuse's defenders, the challenge involved rationing diminishing supplies, maintaining discipline and morale among a population under constant pressure, and hoping for relief from Carthaginian forces or other developments that might break the stalemate. The blockade of Syracuse involved both land and sea components, with Roman forces attempting to close off all routes by which supplies or reinforcements might reach the city. On land, this required maintaining camps positioned to watch all approaches and prevent attempts to break through the siege lines. At sea, Roman ships patrolled the waters around Syracuse, intercepting vessels attempting to reach the city's harbors. The effectiveness of this blockade varied depending on weather conditions, the vigilance of Roman forces, the boldness of those attempting to run the blockade, and the degree of support Syracuse received from Carthaginian naval forces operating in Sicilian waters. Some supplies did reach Syracuse despite the blockade, brought by ships that evaded Roman patrols or by land routes through areas where Roman control remained incomplete. These successes provided temporary relief, but could not fully compensate for the normal flow of grain, wine, oil, and other necessities that the city required to sustain its population. The defenders had to carefully manage whatever supplies they possessed, imposing rationing schemes that distributed available food according to principles that balanced military necessity with social hierarchy and the need to maintain popular support for continued resistance. The disruption of normal routines affected all aspects of urban life. Markets that had operated daily could no longer function normally when supplies became irregular and many goods entirely unavailable. Craftsmen found their work interrupted by demands for military service or by shortages of materials needed for their trades. Religious observances continued, but under circumstances that tested the faithful's confidence in divine favor. The social fabric of the city came under strain as shared hardship either drew communities closer together or exposed underlying tensions and conflicts of interest. For individuals like Archimedes, whose normal activities centered on intellectual work, the siege created multiple forms of disruption. The mental concentration necessary for mathematical investigation competed with anxieties about personal safety, the fate of the city, and the basic requirements of survival under siege conditions. The materials needed for writing might become scarce or be redirected to military purposes such as recording troop dispositions or maintaining accounts of supplies. The social networks through which ideas were exchanged became attenuated as communication with scholars outside Syracuse ceased, and attention within the city focused on immediate survival rather than abstract questions. The mathematical work that had occupied much of his life became difficult to pursue under these circumstances. The routines of study and calculation required peace and security that siege conditions disrupted. Materials for writing might become scarce or be diverted to more immediately pressing needs. The mental concentration necessary for working through complex geometric proofs competed with concerns about survival and the outcome of the conflict. Whatever work Archimedes may have continued during the siege left no certain trace in the historical record. After approximately 2 years of siege, Syracuse fell to Roman forces in 212 before the Common Era. The specific circumstances of the city's capture involved betrayal or opportunistic exploitation of weakened defenses rather than direct assault against the main fortifications. Roman soldiers entered the city and began the process of occupation, encountering varying degrees of resistance from different quarters. The sack of a captured city followed patterns established through long military practice, with soldiers seeking plunder, settling personal scores and asserting control over the defeated population. Archimedes died during this period of the Roman occupation of Syracuse. The circumstances of his death were recorded in several ancient accounts that differ in specific details while agreeing on the basic fact that he was killed by a Roman soldier. One version states that Archimedes was studying geometric diagrams drawn in dust or sand when a soldier approached, and that his instruction to the soldier not to disturb his work provoked the soldier to kill him. Another account suggests that soldiers came to escort him to the Roman commander Marcellus, who had given orders that Archimedes should be brought to him unharmed, but that some confusion or conflict during the encounter led to his death. A third version describes soldiers encountering him while he was carrying mathematical instruments and killing him in the mistaken belief that these objects were valuable possessions worth seizing. The accuracy of these accounts cannot be verified with certainty, and they may represent reconstructions or interpretations by later writers rather than contemporary records. What remains consistent across the sources is that Archimedes died at the hands of a Roman soldier during the fall of Syracuse, that this death occurred despite reported orders from Marcellus to preserve his life, and that his mathematical work continued to occupy him up to or near the time of his death. The precise words exchanged, if any, and the soldier's motivations remain matters of uncertainty rather than established fact. Marcellus reportedly expressed regret at Archimedes' death and took steps to honor his memory. The Roman commander had recognized Archimedes' exceptional abilities and had hoped to present him to Rome as evidence of Syracuse's intellectual achievements and as a potential resource for Roman purposes. The actual death, whether through misunderstanding, indiscipline, or circumstances beyond Marcellus's direct control, prevented this outcome. Marcellus provided for Archimedes' burial and ensured that his family received appropriate consideration in the settlement of affairs following the city's conquest. The tomb erected for Archimedes reportedly featured a sphere inscribed within a cylinder, commemorating his discovery of the relationship between these two forms that he had valued particularly highly. This monument served as a lasting reminder of his mathematical work and the priority he placed on this achievement above his various mechanical inventions and practical contributions. The tomb's location in Syracuse made it a site that could be visited by those interested in Archimedes' legacy, though the physical structure would deteriorate over time without regular maintenance and care. The mathematical works of Archimedes survived through copies that had been sent to other mathematicians and through texts that were preserved despite the disruption of Syracuse's fall. The treatises on geometry, on floating bodies, on spirals, on the measurement of the circle, and on various other subjects continued to circulate among those interested in mathematical questions. Later, scholars in the Hellenistic world and eventually in Rome itself studied these works, attempting to understand Archimedes' methods and results. Some of his writings were lost or survived only in fragmentary form, while others were copied repeatedly and became standard references for advanced geometric study. The process by which ancient texts survived across centuries and across the transitions between different civilizations depended on chains of individual decisions by copyists, scholars, and patrons who chose to invest resources in preserving particular works. Each copy required hours of careful labor transcribing Greek text onto papyrus or later parchment, checking for errors, and ensuring that diagrams were reproduced accurately. The expense of materials and skilled labor meant that choices had to be made about which texts deserved preservation, with some works deemed more valuable and others allowed to disappear as existing copies deteriorated without being replaced. Archimedes' mathematical treatises benefited from being recognized as exceptionally sophisticated contributions that advanced understanding beyond what other geometers had achieved. This reputation encouraged scholars to copy and study his works, creating multiple manuscript traditions that increased the probability of survival even when particular copies were lost to fire, decay, or destruction during periods of war and social upheaval. The technical difficulty of the material meant that only those with substantial mathematical training could fully understand the demonstrations. But this same difficulty marked the works as significant achievements worth preserving for those capable of appreciating them. The mechanical devices and military engines that Archimedes had designed or improved did not survive as physical objects, but accounts of their nature and effectiveness circulated widely. Later writers described these inventions with varying degrees of accuracy and elaboration, sometimes attributing to Archimedes devices that may have been developed by others or that represented improvements on existing technology rather than entirely new creations. The difficulty of distinguishing Archimedes' actual contributions from later attributions and legends increased as time passed and direct evidence disappeared. Written accounts of Archimedes' mechanical work appeared in histories, biographies, and technical treatises that served different purposes and addressed different audiences. Military writers interested in siege warfare discussed the defensive engines used at Syracuse, sometimes offering technical details about their construction and operation, but often focusing on their dramatic effects and the ingenuity displayed in their deployment. Historians recounting the Second Punic War mentioned Archimedes as part of explaining why Syracuse resisted Roman assault for so long, emphasizing the exceptional nature of both the man and his machines without necessarily providing precise technical information. The combination of preserved mathematical treatises and legendary accounts of mechanical achievements created a dual image of Archimedes in later cultural memory. He was remembered both as a pure mathematician whose investigations revealed fundamental truths about geometric relationships, and as a practical inventor whose devices demonstrated the application of knowledge to solving real problems. Different audiences emphasized different aspects of this dual legacy depending on their own interests and values, with some highlighting the theoretical achievements and others focusing on the practical applications. The method of exhaustion that Archimedes had refined for determining areas and volumes influenced subsequent mathematical investigation, providing a rigorous approach to problems involving curved figures and irregular shapes. Later geometers extended these techniques to new situations and developed further refinements. The fundamental insight that bounds could be progressively tightened until they converged on the true value remained valuable for centuries, eventually finding new expression in different mathematical frameworks that emerged long after Archimedes' time. Specific examples of this influence appear in the work of later Hellenistic mathematicians who tackled problems similar to those Archimedes had investigated, using methods that built on his approach while introducing their own innovations. The study of conic sections, curves produced by slicing through cones at various angles, employed techniques related to those Archimedes had developed for handling parabolas and other curved forms. The investigation of solid geometry continued to use methods of comparing unknown volumes to known ones through careful geometric reasoning about proportions and limits. His work on centers of gravity and mechanical equilibrium provided a foundation for later developments in statics and mechanics. The principle of the lever, as Archimedes had demonstrated it, became a standard result taught to students of mathematics and physics. The investigation of floating bodies remained a fundamental contribution to understanding buoyancy and stability, with practical applications in ship design and engineering that extended far beyond the immediate context in which Archimedes had conducted his research. The approximation of the ratio between a circle's circumference and diameter that Archimedes had calculated represented the most accurate determination available for many centuries. Later, mathematicians would develop more efficient methods for computing this value to greater precision, but Archimedes' approach, through inscribed and circumscribed polygons, demonstrated the feasibility of obtaining numerical bounds through geometric reasoning. The value itself found applications in any calculation involving circular measure, making this contribution of both theoretical and practical significance. Among mathematicians, Archimedes' reputation grew over the centuries following his death. His works were studied, commented upon, and preserved as examples of geometric reasoning at its most sophisticated. The rigor of his proofs, the elegance of his results, and the originality of his methods established him as a figure of exceptional accomplishment within the mathematical tradition. Later, scholars measured their own work against the standards he had set, either attempting to match his level of achievement or to extend mathematical knowledge into domains he had not investigated. The transmission of Archimedes' works through successive generations of copyists and translators ensured that his contributions remained accessible even as languages and political systems changed. Greek texts were translated into Arabic during the medieval period, preserving mathematical knowledge through centuries when much classical learning had been lost or forgotten in Europe. These Arabic translations were later rendered into Latin, making Archimedes' works available to European scholars who were rebuilding mathematical and scientific knowledge during the later Middle Ages and Renaissance. The translation of Greek mathematical texts into Arabic began in the 8th and 9th centuries of the Common Era, centered in Baghdad, where the Abbasid caliphs supported the acquisition and translation of Greek works on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Scholars working in this translation movement sought out Greek manuscripts, compared different versions to establish reliable texts, and rendered the content into Arabic while adapting it to the mathematical notation and terminology that had developed in the Islamic world. This work preserved not only the texts themselves, but also commentaries and supplementary materials that helped later readers understand difficult passages. Archimedes' treatises presented particular challenges for translators due to their technical sophistication and their reliance on geometric diagrams that had to be reproduced accurately for the demonstrations to be comprehensible. The Arabic mathematicians who worked with these texts were not merely passive transmitters, but active engagers who studied the mathematics, wrote commentaries explaining difficult points, and in some cases extended Archimedes' methods to new problems. This creative engagement ensured that the knowledge remained alive and useful rather than becoming fossilized text preserved without understanding. Each stage of this transmission introduced possibilities for error, modification, or loss. Some works survived in multiple copies, while others existed in only a single manuscript that might be damaged or difficult to read. Variant readings appeared where copyists had made different choices in transcribing ambiguous passages. Commentaries and additions by later scholars sometimes became intermingled with the original text, creating challenges for those attempting to determine what Archimedes himself had written as opposed to what later interpreters had added. The movement of texts from Arabic into Latin occurred primarily in Spain and Sicily during the 12th and 13th centuries, where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars collaborated in translation projects that made Arabic learning available to Latin readers. These translations often proceeded through multiple stages, with texts first rendered into vernacular languages like Castilian before being translated into Latin, or with translators working from both Greek and Arabic versions to produce composite texts that drew on multiple manuscript traditions. The resulting Latin works sometimes showed traces of this complex transmission history, with passages reflecting Greek phrasing and others showing Arabic influence. Despite these difficulties, the essential content of Archimedes' major works remained accessible to those with sufficient mathematical training to understand them. The geometric proofs could be verified by working through them step by step, checking each inference against the principles of geometry and logic. The results could be confirmed through independent calculation or construction. The validity of the mathematical content did not depend on perfect preservation of every word or phrase, but rather on the integrity of the logical structure that connected conclusions to premises through necessary steps. Renaissance scholars who encountered Archimedes' works through these Latin translations recognized their exceptional quality and sought to produce more accurate versions based on comparison of multiple manuscripts and reconstruction of corrupt passages. The recovery of additional Greek manuscripts from Constantinople and other sources allowed scholars to check Latin translations against original Greek texts, revealing errors and clarifying passages that had been obscure in earlier versions. The invention of printing made it possible to produce multiple identical copies of authoritative editions, reducing the errors that accumulated through repeated manual copying. Modern recovery of some texts that had been lost or were known only in fragmentary form has expanded understanding of the scope of Archimedes' work. A palimpsest, a manuscript whose original text had been scraped away and overwritten with different content, was found to contain portions of works by Archimedes that were not available in other sources. Advanced imaging techniques made it possible to read the underlying text despite its deliberate erasure centuries earlier, revealing mathematical content that had not been part of the previously known corpus. This palimpsest, discovered in Istanbul in the early 20th century after having circulated in private collections, contained portions of the Method, a treatise in which Archimedes described how he had originally discovered some of his results through mechanical reasoning before reformulating them as rigorous geometric proofs. This work provided insight into Archimedes' thinking process and his use of physical intuition to guide mathematical investigation, supplementing the formal treatises that presented only finished demonstrations without revealing the investigative path that had led to them. The recovery of this text illuminated aspects of Archimedes' work that had been suspected but not documented in the previously available corpus. Educational institutions teaching mathematics have regularly included Archimedes' work in their curricula, using his treatises as examples of rigorous reasoning and his results as foundations for further study. Students learning geometry encounter the formulas he derived and the methods he developed, often without detailed knowledge of the historical context in which these discoveries were made. The mathematical content has been integrated into a larger body of knowledge that includes contributions from many cultures and time periods, becoming part of a tradition that extends far beyond its origins in ancient Syracuse. The principle of buoyancy that Archimedes established continues to be taught as a fundamental concept in physics and engineering. Ships are designed with understanding of how displacement relates to weight. Pumps move fluids through pipes according to principles that Archimedes helped clarify, and structures are built with calculations involving centers of gravity that descend from his work. These practical applications exist alongside the pure mathematical results, demonstrating how theoretical investigation can eventually lead to useful knowledge even when immediate application was not the primary motivation. Among the specific mathematical results that have retained particular significance is the relationship between the sphere and cylinder that Archimedes considered his greatest achievement. This result captures something essential about the nature of mathematical discovery, the recognition of unexpected relationships between different geometric forms. The ratio of 2/3 that connects these volumes possesses a simplicity that makes it memorable, while reflecting deeper properties of three-dimensional space and measurement. The various stories about Archimedes' defense of Syracuse during the Roman siege have been embellished and elaborated over centuries of retelling. Some accounts describe mirrors used to set enemy ships on fire through concentrated sunlight, an achievement that, while theoretically possible within ancient technology, would have required precise coordination and favorable conditions, unlikely to have been reliably available. Other stories emphasize the fear and confusion that Archimedes' defensive engines created among Roman attackers, presenting his mechanical innovations as decisive factors in prolonging the siege. These narratives serve purposes beyond historical accuracy, functioning as illustrations of the power of intelligence and knowledge against brute force, though the ultimate outcome of the siege demonstrates the limits of such advantages when confronted with determined military pressure. The intellectual environment that had allowed Archimedes to pursue mathematical investigation with such depth and originality did not survive the political changes that followed Rome's expansion. The centers of Greek learning gradually declined or transformed as Roman power consolidated. Alexandria maintained its library and scholarly community for several more centuries, but the production of original mathematical work diminished. Later, scholars focused more on commentary and preservation of earlier achievements than on extending the boundaries of knowledge in the manner that Archimedes and his contemporaries had done. Archimedes' life coincided with a particular moment in Mediterranean history when Greek intellectual traditions had reached sophisticated development, while political fragmentation still allowed space for independent city-states to maintain their own character. The subsequent unification under Roman power brought changes that included both preservation and transformation of earlier achievements. Mathematical knowledge was maintained, but developed differently within Roman culture than it had under earlier Greek conditions. The passage of more than 2 millennia since Archimedes' death has not diminished the mathematical validity of his proofs or the value of his results. The geometric relationships he demonstrated remain true independent of historical change or cultural variation. A circle's area equals that of a triangle whose base equals the circumference and whose height equals the radius, as Archimedes showed, regardless of who performs the calculation or where or when they do so. This permanence distinguishes mathematical knowledge from other forms of human understanding that may be more dependent on particular contexts or perspectives. Later attempts to write Archimedes' biography have been constrained by the limited evidence available about the details of his life. The dates of his birth and death can be established only approximately. His relationship with the rulers of Syracuse is documented primarily through later accounts rather than contemporary records. His personal circumstances, daily routines, and individual character remain largely unknowable beyond what can be inferred from his written works and the few anecdotes preserved by ancient writers. The focus necessarily falls on his mathematical achievements rather than on biographical particulars, with the life serving mainly as context for understanding the work. The city of Syracuse, where Archimedes spent most or all of his life, has continued to exist through all the subsequent centuries, though transformed repeatedly by different rulers, populations, and historical circumstances. The ancient fortifications have largely disappeared, replaced by later construction or reduced to archaeological remains. The harbors still function for maritime activity, though their importance has varied greatly across different eras. The Greek character of the city has been overlaid by Roman, Byzantine, Arab, Norman, and modern Italian influences, each leaving traces in the urban fabric and cultural traditions. Modern visitors to Syracuse who come seeking connection with Archimedes find little physical evidence of his presence. The tomb with its sphere and cylinder was lost. Centuries ago, its location forgotten despite being noted by Roman writers who visited Syracuse in the generations after Archimedes' death. No buildings or structures can be definitively associated with his life. The connection exists primarily through historical knowledge rather than through tangible remains, a relationship mediated by texts and traditions rather than by direct physical continuity. The integration of Archimedes' contributions into the larger edifice of mathematical knowledge means that his work is encountered today primarily as part of a collective achievement rather than as the production of a single individual. Students learning calculus are using methods that developed from the approach to limits that Archimedes pioneered, though the modern formulation differs substantially from his geometric technique of exhaustion. Engineers calculating stresses and forces apply principles that can be traced back through many intermediate developments to the fundamental insights about levers and equilibrium that Archimedes systematically investigated. His life and work exemplify certain possibilities available to human beings: the capacity for sustained concentration on abstract problems, the ability to discover necessary relationships through logical reasoning, the satisfaction that comes from understanding complex phenomena through simple principles. These capacities exist independent of particular historical periods or social arrangements, though the opportunities to exercise them depend greatly on circumstances that provide both the resources necessary for intellectual work and the cultural valuing of such activity. The 75 years that Archimedes lived encompassed remarkable changes in the Mediterranean political landscape, but occurred during a period of relative continuity in mathematical development. The methods he used and the problems he investigated emerged from traditions established by earlier geometers and were refined by his own contributions before being transmitted to later scholars. His individual brilliance manifested within a context that both enabled and constrained what was possible, making his achievements remarkable without being incomprehensible or miraculous. The violent manner of his death during the fall of Syracuse stands in contrast to the abstract, timeless character of his mathematical work. Human mortality and historical contingency ended a particular life at a particular moment, while the knowledge that life had produced continued independent of its creator's survival. This disjunction between the fragility of individual existence and the durability of knowledge represents one of the persistent tensions in human experience, the contrast between our biological limitations and our capacity to create things that outlast us. Subsequent centuries have seen Archimedes invoked for various purposes as an example of genius, as proof of ancient Greek intellectual achievement, as a symbol of the practical value of theoretical knowledge, as a martyr to ignorant military force. These uses reflect the needs and perspectives of those doing the invoking, rather than any unambiguous meaning inherent in Archimedes' life and work. The historical figure becomes transformed into a cultural resource, available for deployment in different contexts and for different purposes. The transmission of knowledge across generations and across cultural boundaries represents one of humanity's most consequential activities. Archimedes' work survived because people considered it worth preserving, worth copying, worth translating, worth teaching to new generations of students. This continuity of valuation created the possibility for cumulative development of mathematical understanding, allowing later mathematicians to build on earlier foundations rather than having to rediscover everything independently. The specific historical circumstances of 3rd century Syracuse that formed the context for Archimedes' life have vanished, reconstructible only partially through archaeological evidence and textual sources that themselves require interpretation. The social structures, daily rhythms, physical environment, and lived experience of that time and place cannot be fully recovered. What has been preserved more successfully is the intellectual content that Archimedes produced, which can be understood and appreciated even by those with no detailed knowledge of the historical setting. His death during the Roman conquest marked the end of Syracuse's period as an independent center of Greek culture. The city continued to exist and eventually prospered again under different rulers and in different roles, but the particular combination of circumstances that had supported Archimedes' work did not reconstitute itself. The Mediterranean world moved into a different phase of its history, one in which large empires, rather than independent city-states, dominated political organization. Mathematical work continued but under changed conditions, and often in different locations. The contrast between Archimedes' theoretical investigations and his practical contributions to Syracuse's defense reflects broader questions about the relationship between knowledge and power, between understanding and application, between intellectual activity and worldly affairs. His own priorities, insofar as they can be determined, appear to have favored the mathematical work over the mechanical inventions, valuing knowledge for itself rather than primarily for its usefulness. The circumstances of war compelled him to apply his understanding to practical problems, but this application represented a diversion from what he considered most important. The question of what Archimedes might have achieved had he lived longer or worked under different circumstances remains unanswerable, but inevitable. Mathematical investigation is open-ended, with each solution typically suggesting further problems to investigate. The methods he developed could have been applied to additional cases. New relationships might have been discovered, extensions and generalizations of earlier results could have been pursued. The actual historical record shows what was accomplished. What might have been accomplished remains speculative. The intellectual tradition of which Archimedes formed a part continued to develop for several more centuries before declining in the late ancient period. The reasons for this decline involved complex interactions between social, political, economic, and cultural factors. The preservation and eventual recovery of earlier achievements, including those of Archimedes, allowed for later renewal of mathematical investigation under different historical circumstances. This pattern of development, decline, and renewal has characterized human intellectual history across many domains and cultures. In the final estimation, Archimedes' significance rests on the combination of mathematical depth, methodological rigor, and breadth of application that characterized his work. He investigated fundamental questions about measurement and proportion, developed techniques that remained valuable for centuries, and achieved results that combined elegance with substance. The historical circumstances of his life and death add human interest to the story, but remain secondary to the intellectual achievements that justify continued attention to his work. Time continued its passage after Archimedes' death, as it had during his life. The movements of celestial bodies that his father had studied proceeded according to the same patterns. The geometric relationships that Archimedes had investigated remained true, regardless of who knew them or what use was made of that knowledge. The sphere and the cylinder maintained their 2-to-3 ratio independent of human awareness or appreciation. The world continued according to principles that mathematics could describe, but not alter, indifferent to individual lives while remaining susceptible to understanding by those with the capacity and opportunity to investigate its regularities.